Hello, everyone. Because we have two presenters today, and we are fortunate enough to have them for our webinar speakers. Even today, as usual, we have an interesting topic. The topic is names and the Old Testament research. When it comes to names, our names are an incredibly important part of our identity when we talk about our name, and they carry deep personal, our spiritual, cultural, familial, and as well as historical connections. So when we talk about names, names are more than just labels. For example, to the ancient Hebrews and the Babylonians, nothing existed until it had a name. So names express its characteristics and also their character. So when it comes to biblical names, for example, for today's topic, sometimes in Bible, biblical names sometimes express the parents' reaction to the birth of their child, or maybe sometimes used to communicate God's message, and sometimes it used to establish an affiliation with God, and so on and so forth. So it is very important for us to be reminded, to understand, and also to relearn again the importance and also the significance of name, the importance of name, and especially in the Old Testament. And today we have two speakers, Dr. Caleb Howard and Dr. James Bejon. Now I shall give time for Mr. Johnson Rajendran, who is our Vice Principal cum Academic Dean, to introduce the theme as well as the speakers.
Thank you, Gian, for giving me the opportunity to introduce my friends and as they for this webinar. And it's my joy and privilege to introduce today's webinar speakers, and especially both Caleb Howard and James Bejon. They are a good friend of me. And when I visited Tyndale House last year, and both of them were a great source of my encouragement and also help. And especially Dr. Caleb and his family is so close to my heart, and we went to church together, and they made me feel at home when I was there in UK. So I just really want to thank Caleb, Erin, and the kids, and especially again James for your friendship and fellowship there in the UK, and actually with Dr. Caleb, I began this conversation to have this webinar last year itself. It's actually 8 months long discussion with him. So he graciously accepted, and today he is. And I would like to introduce both of them formally. And let me start with Dr. Caleb Howard. He's a research fellow in Old Testament and Ancient Near East, and also he is an editor in Tyndale Bulletin, and he's a research fellow in the Tyndale House. And Caleb Howard studies the text, history, and scholarship of ancient Mesopotamia and the Levant. While studying the Hebrew Bible and other texts in Northwest Semitic languages such as Hebrew, Aramaic, and Ugaritic, his interest was drawn to the text of Mesopotamia, written in the cuneiform script in the Akkadian and the Sumerian Sumerian languages. His current book project investigates the mechanics of scribal production of Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions. The basic of this project is first-hand collation and photography of royal inscription of the Assyrian king Ashurnarispal II, and in various museum collections, transcriptions and photographs of these inscriptions with notes on the habits of the scribes and artisans who produce them will be made available to the scholars and the public via online repository of cuneiform text called ORACC. He is also studying personal names in cuneiform tablets from the 2nd millennium BC, especially those of the ancient cities of Alala and Ugarit. This work will also be documented in online database, and which will provide a means of studying the social history of ancient Near East through personal names. And he is a scholar, and he is currently, as I have already mentioned, a research fellow in the Tyndale House, and especially in the area of Old Testament and Ancient Near East. And he's also editor at Tyndale Bulletin, and he's a research associate at St. Edmund College, Cambridge, and affiliated scholar at McDonald Institute of Archaeological Research and Cambridge. And let me also introduce my friend James Bejon. And James' background lies in music and financial maths. James has recently, however, become involved in explicitly biblical research. His main research interests include onomastics, chronology, and figural interpretation of the Gospels. James is currently pursuing a PhD at Cambridge University focused on the Semantic content of biblical names. He worships at a church in Romford, London, where he lives. This is our honor to have both of them with us. And both of them are eminent scholars, and Dr. Howard Cowleb have presented and published many articles in many places. The theme of this webinar, names and the Old Testament research. So thank you so much, Gian, for giving me the opportunity to introduce Dr. Caleb and James. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Johnson, for that kind introduction. I'm very glad to be here, very glad to be speaking with you. And Johnson, it was a great privilege to get to know you when you were here. And I'm so excited about what you all are doing in India. I spent a bit of time in Chennai about 15 years ago, and really enjoyed my time there. It was a great time. And very glad to be here. Thank you for having us. Greetings from Tyndale House here in Cambridge in the UK. Tyndale House is a biblical studies research institute, which is for the church. We want to support the church in every way that we can. And so James and I are involved in that work. And thank you for letting us be involved in small ways in what you're doing also in India. At Tyndale House at the moment, we are, as Johnson said, studying names in the Old Testament in the context of the names in the ancient Near East, the time and place of the Old Testament. And James and I are both involved in a research project around that subject. James and I work together. He's a friend of mine. He knows more about names than I do easily. So you don't know it, but you really lucked out having James on this. So yeah, glad to be presenting with him as well. Thanks again for having us. We're planning to do this sort of in two parts. So there are two of us, and James is going to present first. He's going to talk about semantic patterns in names, and then I'm going to talk about how names are clarified, commented on in the Old Testament. And now over to James.
Well, thank you very much, all of you. It really is just a huge privilege to be here. Thank you for everyone who's logged in and so forth. So just with you in this talk, I want to look at a couple of main things. Firstly, what a name is, and really I mean a personal name when I say that, what a name is, and then some semantic patterns in names. So what is a name? Seems a good way to kick off. We can think of a name, for the purpose of our talk now, as a word with two types of properties. Now, first, a name will have referential properties. It will refer to someone. The name James refers to me. Secondly, it will have what we can call lexical properties. Names aren't generally just nonsense words which people have made up. They come from known lexemes, which you can look up in a dictionary and so forth. And so to take an example of which has both these properties, the name Peter has referential properties. It refers to people like Peter Williams, who you may know from Tyndale House, Peter the Apostle, Peter Parker, who's a character in Spider-Man, I understand. I'm not sure that's right, but I said that to try and seem culturally relevant. And Peter also has lexical properties. It comes from the Greek word Petra. So names have these two types of properties, referential and lexical properties. And by virtue of those two properties, they also have all sorts of different properties. So because names refer to people, to concrete people and so forth, and because they're based on known lexemes, they will have semantic properties. So to go back to our example of Peter, the name Peter will have a geographical distribution. It will be more common, for instance, in Christian countries and English-speaking countries. It will have a chronological distribution. You know, it will have a history in the BC era, but as Christianity has, by God's grace, spread across the globe, the name Peter will have spread. At the same time, the name Peter will have these semantic properties because the Greek Petra is the word for stone. Peter will carry with it the meaning or the translation stone. And what I am doing, particularly in my PhD work, is looking at particular relationships between the semantic properties of these names, all sorts of different names, and their referential properties, their geographical and chronological properties, and all the rest of it. And so to kind of phrase that in terms of a question, I'm looking at questions like, are the semantics of names something that people don't really consider, which is certainly the case in England. People don't think hard about the semantics of names. And if that's the case, then really you might expect their distribution to be pretty much random. You wouldn't expect to see patterns in the semantics of names. Or do names tend to be things that semantically fit their environment? And I'm going to be arguing for the latter proposition. I'm going to be arguing that names fit semantically the environments in which they're found. And so I thought I'd just kick off with a quick example. Sorry, I'm struggling to read my screen because I've got this big thing across it that says a participant has enabled closed captioning, and I can't I can't close it. But anyway, hopefully I can remember my slides well enough. Let's look at an example of some names which fit their environment very nicely. Now, here I've got up on screen for us the book of Ezra. This is chapter 2, and Ezra says to us, he says, these were the people of the province, that's the province of Judah, ultimately, who came up out of captivity in Babylon of the exiles. And he goes on, he says, they returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each man to his own town. And afterwards, we get this big list. And this is a list of the way in which Ezra is recording the kind of the number of people in different families that come back from exile in Babylon to Judah. So we get the sons of Shephatiah, the sons of Arach, the sons of Pachat Moab, and so forth, with numbers. And so these are basically clan, or you could call them family names. What we've really got here is what, as far as I can see, is the world's earliest list of surnames. These are a list of surnames of people who come back to Judah. And then as you continue reading the Bible, in Nehemiah, for instance, you will see people who refer to themselves as a son of Bevi, there in verse 11, or a son of Paseach, who comes later on. So these are basically family names. And I want to show you various ways in which they fit their environment. So I've given you here just a selection of those family names and provided a translation of them. The name Paseach means lame, and so on. And to give you some context, next to all those, I've put semantic equivalents of those names in all sorts of different cultures' surnames. So we have there some Akkadian equivalents. So Hunzu, like Paseach, means lame. There is a Palestinian equivalent. You can go to Palestine today and meet people who still have that family name. And you can very quickly see that these family names that we have in the book of Ezra, they really do fit their environment. They've got the kind of semantic content that we would expect from a family name. Even in English surnames, we have the same kind of semantic content, Hult, and so forth. So you can see, I hope, that these names in Ezra fit the broader world of family names. So they've got that kind of cross-cultural fitness. They've also got what you could call a kind of inner coherence. When we translate these names, it's not just a jumble of words picked out of a dictionary at random. They come in what you could call categories, lame, deaf, loudmouth. This is really a list of what you could call kind of uncomplimentary family names. They form a little category. Elsewhere, we've got a little category of occupational family names. Again, we have equivalents in England, Smith, Carpenter, and so forth. So we can say that these family names in Ezra, they fit their environment insofar as they're what we would expect from a family name semantically, and at the same time they have this internal consistency. They fit neatly into categories. And so what I want to do in the kind of second half of this talk with you is to see if we can be a little bit more precise about this idea of fitness. And what I want to do, therefore, particularly is think with you about 4 ways in which names can be said to semantically fit their environments. And the first is this, which we've already touched on. They can basically have the typical, the classic kind of semantics that we would expect of names. Almost all cultures that I'm aware of have female names within them, which are names of flowers. In England, we have rose and poppy. In the Bible, we have names like Susanna and Hadassah, which are, again, the names of flowers or fragrant plants. I've tried to insert there from some Hindu and Tamil names. Apologies if they're not accurate. This is not my area of specialty, so you can correct them later. But if they're not right, I'm almost certain that there will be flower names within female names in Hindu and Tamil name pools. Everywhere you go, you find this. And so when you encounter a woman who has a name based around a flower, you can say that fits its environment. It just fits in with what we know of the wider world of female names. It really does have kind of classic semantics. A second way in which a name can fit in its environment is by corresponding to a particular feature of that environment. Here are some Japanese names, and they match up very closely to wildlife, plant life, which is specific to Japan. You have people whose names translate in Japanese as bamboo and rice plant, and there are all sorts of other ones, cherry blossom and Japanese chestnut and so forth, which we don't have over here, but they have in Japan. Bedouin names are almost always built around kind of life in the desert, names that mean desert, tent, or that refer to a long dry spell. Elsewhere in the Arab world, you often get names which mean things like cloud and rain. And part of the reason for that is because they are things that have a positive connotation in the Arab world, because in a hot climate, you're pleased if you see some shelter and some rain. We don't like it so much in England because we're fed up of clouds and rain. And so you won't find people with names like that, but you will find people with names like summer. Or if you find people with a month name, you will find women named April or May or June. These are kind of more attractive connotations that they have. We can see the same kind of things in biblical names, and I'll look more at some biblical names later. There are a couple of different biblical names which refer to mountain animals, Yael and Dishon. And when we can pinpoint those names to particular geographical locales, we see that they're invariably connected with the highlands. Jael is a woman who lived in the kind of hillside of Galilee, and we have 2 Dishons in the hill country of Seir, it's called. It's kind of modern day Saudi Arabia, really. So those are a couple of ways in which we can say that names can fit their environments. Here's a third way, which I have called fashionable fitness. Certain types of semantics just become popular in certain areas, and it's not really clear why, but they do. And so a lot of Arab societies have a massive cluster of weapon names that go from old weapons like swords to more modern weapons, I suppose. I don't need to say too much about those. The same in Turkey, although with hardness names, these are actually Turkish surnames. You just get these kind of trends in semantics building up. In Benjamin, in the tribe of Benjamin within Israel, they're very keen on body part related names. The name Benjamin means probably son of the right hand. And elsewhere amongst his descendants, we see lots of names like that, some of which are unique to the tribe of Benjamin. And that's actually true of Benjamin's geographical names. There are places which are named after body parts, particularly in Benjamin. Just a couple of days, I came across this paper from a scholar in Israel, and he's identified a term katef, which means shoulder, which is used uniquely in reference to Benjamin's geographical names, their individual bearers' lives. And I want to look at this a little bit now. Well, let me talk about it a bit, and hopefully the slides will reactivate at some point. But names can fit their individual bearers, and so you might have someone named after the day when they were born. A common name in the Old Testament is Shabbatai, and that refers to someone who has been born on the day of the Sabbath. A New Testament equivalent of that actually is Bar Sabbat, or Bar Sabbas, rather, the son of a Sabbath. There is Shabbatai, which I was talking about. Here is another name, Kalila. This is a name given to female girls in Yemen. If they're very light, it means light, and if they're light in weight, then girls go by that name. And some of the names that we've already looked at actually have that same fitness to their individual bearers. These names that we looked at to do with clouds and rain, they're not just assigned at random. They're more often than not given to people who are born on a cloudy day or a rainy day, born in the desert, born during a period of drought or dryness, and so forth. So we've got these different ways in which names fit their environments. And I think probably the main point I'd like you to take away from that is that names they're not just labels. Now, they are labels, they refer to people, obviously, but they also semantically fit their environments, which implies that the people who've chosen these names for their children, most often, they've thought very carefully about them and about their meaning. And so when we see patterns in the Bible, in semantics, in the semantic content of names, this isn't just something odd that the biblical authors are pointing out. This isn't an unusual kind of literary game that people are playing. And when a narrator analyzes a name, this isn't something kind of odd or weird or contrived. This is just how people do very often think about names in different cultures and how people analyze names. And just as a very, very quick example to try and kind of draw all these things together, I thought I'd give you an example out of the book of Ruth. You're probably familiar with the story. Elimelech and Naomi have two children, and they are named Mahlon and Chilion. Now, these are very interesting names. If you read a commentary on these names, they will often point out that they sound like names which kind of are to do with illness. They sound like words for illness and for wasting away in Hebrew. And it's then suggested that these are kind of what you could call artificial names. They've just been picked for the sake of a story rather than being genuine historical names. Now, when you look at those names more closely, you actually see that those names are to do with times of drought and dryness. We met one of them earlier. The name Mahlon is actually a kind of Hebrew equivalent of this female name, Mechela. It refers to someone who's born in a time of drought or dryness, and the word Chilion refers to things that are used up, and it refers to a time of famine. Now, by contrast, we have these names in Moab. I've put there Orpah, which refers to rainfall, and Ruth, which means well watered. Here is just a page photocopied out of a modern Arabic name book, and they refer to the kind of equivalent of the name Ruth, Rawa, this would be pronounced, and it refers to water. So we've got the situation where you have names to do with a famine in Bethlehem and names to do with fertility and rainfall in Moab, which is precisely the situation which is described in the book of Ruth. He's the front cover of a paper which talks about periods when things have been almost very inhospitable in Israel, and yet they've been much better in Moab. And here is a a paper that locates a long, prolonged dry event in Israel in the 12th century, which could have been contemporary with the events of the book of Ruth. So are these names to do with illness? Well, I don't doubt that God caused them to be chosen in order to preempt and kind of almost predict what would befall these individuals, Mahlon and Kilion. But at the same time, they are names that can have a very normal human explanation. Quite likely, they were chosen simply because there was a prolonged dry spell in Israel. They were named like this because they were born at a time of drought. Later, to kind of avoid that, Elimelech and Naomi's family migrated to Moab, and there they encountered people who had more fertile names. So I will leave that there, and hopefully I'm able to stop sharing or just jump on to Caleb. Not a problem at all.
Friends, if you have any questions.
Let me ask this question. The two names, Mahlon and Kilion, again, the meaning of those names are very negative, meaning. When the parents put their name, would they understand this meaning that, this is the name, the meaning of the name? And if they know it, and then why do they put this negative name for their both boys?
Okay, thank you. Well, so my contention would be that these were names given to people who were born in a drought, and that would have been what their parents would have understood by those names. Now, when it's said that they sound like terms for illness in Hebrew, I think that's absolutely right. They do, but I don't think they're the first thing that would have come to mind when people heard that kind of name. Caleb is going to be talking more about some examples along those lines. But I don't think naming your child something like drought would necessarily have had a negative connotation in and of itself, because it was just part of a known culture. It was a part of a way of doing things. Some people would have been named after rain, some after drought, some after sunshine, some after snow. You can go to Jordan today and find women called Falgia, which is the Arabic word for snow, kind of converted into a female name. So yeah, I don't think those names would have had negative connotations to their bearers. Let me have a look in this. Can the names in the Old Testament of Old Testament persons perhaps bear the professions of the people in their cognate geographical and cultural backdrops? So if I understand that correctly, then yes, they can. So we looked at some examples in my list of family names from Ezra of a name Harsha, for instance, which means smith. And in Babylon, about the same time, you can find the family name Napachu, which also means smith. So Old Testament names can refer to a profession, and so can names, cognate names in the same region, if I've understood that correctly. Oh, I'll do one more. Did the names in the book of Ruth and other Old Testament names given for the writing's sake, did they have different names in reality? Okay, so my suggestion with Ruth is that the names were chosen for Mahlon and Kilion, and also for Orpah and Ruth. Those names were chosen in light of normal customs. They're still chosen in light of the same customs in some parts of the Arab world today. Those names had a deeper meaning, you could say, or those names had sounded like things which their bearers would later experience. They sounded like types of illness which Mahlon and Kilion would later suffer and die. And the author chose to record those names for that reason, because of the light they shed on Ruth and Naomi's stories. So I think the author is faithfully recording names that were historically given to children simply because they were born in a drought. And I think what the author is doing is recording them. We get hundreds of people in the Bible who we don't know their names, or they might just be a man of Judah or something like that. So what the kind of the literary aspect of them is that the author is recording them for us because they're symbolic. So I will stop sharing there, and Caleb can take over.